For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Jeremiah 29:11. The story you are about to hear is not just about loss. It's about how God can turn even the deepest sorrow into a testimony of hope. Imagine standing in the silence of an empty house, the laughter long gone, the walls echoing only memories. That's where her journey begins. A widow, clinging to fading faith, unaware that a single letter hidden inside a dusty Bible would change her life forever. This is more than a story about grief. It's about the moment when despair collides with God's timing. When she almost threw away what she thought was just another piece of paper, she had no idea it carried a message that would anchor her soul and guide her through the storm. Before we continue, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Together we share stories of faith and resilience that remind us, even in the darkest seasons, God is still writing our future. The house stood in silence, its walls painted with shadows of memories. Every corner held a whisper of laughter that once filled the rooms, but now only the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of an old clock kept her company. The widow sat by the window, staring at the streetlights outside, wondering how life had shifted so drastically from warmth to emptiness. Her husband's absence felt heavier in the evenings, when the night stretched too long, and loneliness seemed to breathe through the cracks of the walls. She touched the edge of the table, tracing with her fingers the faint marks of dinners they once shared, and a lump formed in her throat. Bills piled up on the kitchen counter, unopened envelopes stacked like reminders of a world that kept moving forward without mercy. She had tried to ignore them, telling herself tomorrow would bring strength, but tomorrow always arrived with the same weight. The grief was not just emotional, it was practical, pressing, demanding. Her savings were dwindling, her job long gone after months of absence caused by the loss. She often asked herself how she would endure another day, another week, without collapsing under the crushing reality of survival. Her faith, once her anchor, now wavered like a candle flame fighting against the wind. She had prayed, night after night, for peace, for understanding, but heaven felt silent. The Bible sat on a dusty shelf, untouched for months, because every time she tried to open it, she feared the words inside would pierce her heart with more questions than answers. It wasn't that she didn't believe. It was that she no longer knew how to believe through the pain. Sometimes she whispered, "God, are you still here?" But the silence that followed made her doubt. Her nights were the hardest. The bed felt too large, the sheets too cold, and the emptiness too loud. She often turned on the television just for noise, letting meaningless programs fill the void until her eyelids surrendered to exhaustion. Yet sleep never lasted long. At 3 in the morning, she would wake to the sound of her own thoughts, regrets, memories, fears, swirling like storm clouds inside her chest. The walls of the house seemed to lean closer, pressing in, reminding her of everything she had lost. Outside, life appeared normal. Neighbors walked their dogs. Children laughed on the sidewalks. Cars passed by carrying people toward their daily routines. But from her window, the world looked distant, unreachable, as if she were trapped inside a glass box where no one could hear her cries. She longed to step outside, to feel sunlight on her skin and believe it still had warmth for her too. But her grief chained her, whispering lies that she had no place in the rhythm of life anymore. Still, there was something about the silence that lingered, as if it were waiting for her to notice. The house, though empty, seemed to hold a secret, a message buried in the ordinary. She didn't know it yet, but this silence was preparing her for a discovery that would breathe light into her darkest night. The letter was already there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to be found. And in that quiet evening, as she closed her eyes and let another tear slip down her cheek, she whispered once more, God, if you're still here, please show me." It was a prayer not of strength, but of surrender. Little did she know, the answer was closer than she ever imagined, resting quietly between the fragile pages of a forgotten Bible. Morning light slipped through thin curtains and turned the dust in the living room into slow-falling stars. She had not planned to clean. She only reached for a stacked bill, then another, and somehow the motion became a ritual. Folding blankets, aligning picture frames, rescuing a mug from the arm of the couch. Each small task kept her ahead of the ache by a breath or two. The air smelled faintly of lemon cleanser and old wood. The floor creaked with every careful step. When she paused at the bookcase, her fingers hovered above years of paper spines, pausing on titles that once felt urgent and now felt like strangers. Behind a row of forgotten novels, something square edged out, stubborn and familiar. She knew the shape before she saw the cover. It was the family Bible, its black leather dulled to charcoal, corners softened by hands that had opened it in darker seasons. A thin film of dust veiled the gold-stamped letters, and when she lifted it, the cover sighed against the first page. The scent, paper and ink, faintly sweet, met her like a memory. He used to rest it on his knee Sunday mornings, the blue vein at his wrist pulsing while he underlined quietly, lips moving to a verse he loved. She swallowed. The room felt smaller, the clock louder, the weight in her arms heavier than the book itself. She carried it to the kitchen table, cleared a space between envelopes, and set it down as if placing something fragile back where it belonged. As she opened to the flyleaf, a sliver slipped free, an aging fold, the color of tea with milk, sealed at the edge by time and intent. It skated across the table and stopped near the stack of bills. A letter. Her breath hitched. She brushed dust from the fold, revealing a corner of handwriting she recognized instantly. Clean, steady lines, the kind that made grocery lists look like promises. Her stomach tightened. For a heartbeat, she wanted to slide the letter into the nearest drawer, or the trash, or anywhere its contents couldn't reach her. Grief had a way of turning good things into sharp edges, and she was already covered in little cuts. The trash can stood open beneath the sink, a black mouth waiting. She pinched the letter between thumb and forefinger, held it above the bin, and felt the tremble that rose from her wrist to her shoulder. "Not now," she whispered, to herself, to the past, to the God she wasn't sure was listening. A loosened thread on the envelope snagged her nail and held fast, the smallest resistance. She lowered her hand. She wasn't ready for more pain, but she wasn't ready to live afraid of paper either. The hum of the refrigerator deepened, like a quiet chord that steadied the air. She sat. The chair legs clicked against tile, that small, ordinary sound reminding her she was still here. Turning the envelope over, she saw his initials at the flap, the way he used to mark things he wanted to remember. A date rested beneath, written months before the hospital, before the last ambulance, before the hallway where goodbyes echo. She traced the numbers, then the curve of a letter that started her name. Heat pricked behind her eyes. She pressed the envelope flat against the table to smooth it, careful, reverent, afraid that opening it might unspool a thread she couldn't rewind. Memory rose uninvited. Late-night coffee at that same table, his sleeve brushing her arm while he read aloud a verse about valleys and shadows, the lamp throwing an amber circle over their hand. He had a habit of tucking notes where she would trip over them, inside coat pockets, beneath pillows, even between cereal boxes, each one a small nudge toward joy. "Take the blue umbrella. It might rain. Don't forget your scarf. I love the way you laugh when you're tired." The kindness of those notes felt unbearable now, like sunlight on a bruise. Still, the memory warmed the room just enough for her to breathe deeper. She thumbed the envelope's edge. Paper rasped softly, a cricket on summer pavement. "Okay," she murmured, more to the silence than to herself. One line. She fed the tip of her nail beneath the sealed edge, lifting carefully so nothing tore, so nothing broke more than it already had. The glue surrendered with a quiet crackle. She paused, palms flat on either side of the letter, eyes closed to steady the tremor, then drew the folded sheet free. The paper felt cool, almost damp with the chill that clung to rooms rarely open to daylight. She unfolded it once, twice, and the lines unfurled like a path. Her gaze fell to the first words and stopped. If you're reading this, it means I didn't get to say everything I wanted. She didn't move. The kitchen faded to a soft blur. The bills, the lemon scent, the steady tick of the clock. Only the handwriting remained sharp, a voice she knew by heart, speaking from the page with the calm certainty he always carried. She exhaled, slow and shallow, the kind of breath you take at a cliff's edge. Then, holding the letter as if it were a lit match in a dark room, she began to read. The first line blurred before her eyes, not from faded ink, but from the flood gathering behind her lashes. She pressed her palm against her chest, as if to hold her heart steady, and forced herself to read again. If you're reading this, it means I didn't get to say everything I wanted. The handwriting looked alive, curling letters rising from the page like breath still warm. Each word was simple, yet it carried the weight of his voice, the timbre she still heard when she woke from dreams too real. The kitchen seemed to vanish. She could almost hear him clearing his throat before speaking, pausing just long enough to make her lean closer. The second paragraph began with tenderness, disguised as instruction. Don't let the silence trick you into believing you are alone. The God who carried us yesterday will carry you tomorrow. She felt the sting in her throat again. He had always spoken this way, turning faith into something practical, a compass that pointed her toward daylight. She remembered nights when he prayed over their meals, even when bills outnumbered the food on the table. His faith had been stubborn, like roots gripping rock, and now here it was, written down as if he had known she would need to borrow it when her own belief ran thin. She read on. Take care of the small things. Open the curtains each morning. Breathe in fresh air. Water the plants even when they look withered. They will remind you that life does not end in winter. It waits for spring. Her hand trembled as she traced the margin of the page. He had noticed her habit of skipping little tasks when sorrow weighed too heavily. How could he have known she would need these words more than food itself? She pushed her chair back slightly, eyes wandering to the window where a small fern sat, its leaves yellowing from neglect. A lump tightened in her throat. The letter was speaking into her now, not just her memories. The ink traveled further down the page. If fear tells you that tomorrow has no room for you, answer it with truth. You are stronger than you think, because you are held by a love greater than your grief. She closed her eyes and mouthed the words, repeating them slowly, tasting the strength they carried. For months, she had been at war with fear, the kind that whispers you've been forgotten, abandoned, left behind. Yet here was a voice she trusted telling her otherwise, anchoring her trembling faith to something immovable. The letter didn't erase her pain, but it lit a small candle inside it. She flipped the page over, her fingers brushing the faded fold lines. The words continued, deliberate, almost prophetic. I don't want you to lock yourself away in sorrow. Open the door when someone knocks, even if you feel you have nothing left to give. God will send people, and through them he will remind you you're not invisible. She felt the prickle of memory. How often she had ignored the doorbell, letting knocks echo unanswered. Shame washed over her, not for hiding, but for believing she had to. Tears streamed down freely now, dripping onto the page and smearing one letter into a watercolor blur. Then came the promise, written in bold strokes, as though he pressed the pen harder on purpose. I want you to know, my love for you was real, but God's love is eternal. When you can't hear me, hear him. When you miss my presence, lean into his. And when the weight feels unbearable, remember this. There will be light again, and you will laugh again. She clutched the letter to her chest, rocking slightly, the way she once did when comforting herself after hospital visits. The words didn't feel like goodbye. They felt like a bridge between then and now, stretching into a future she couldn't yet imagine but dared to hope for. As the last lines unfolded, she could hardly breathe for the ache. Promise me you won't give up. Carry on, not just for us, but for the life still waiting for you. You are not finished. She read the words aloud, her voice cracking but resolute, as if speaking them made them binding. A silence followed, deep and sacred, filling the room with something stronger than loneliness. For the first time in months, she felt not abandoned, but spoken to, not lost, but found. She folded the letter carefully, laid it against her heart, and whispered, "I promise." It was the beginning of a vow she never expected to make, a vow that would carry her into the battles ahead. Night fell heavy over the house, pressing shadows against the walls as if darkness itself wanted to claim the room. She sat on the edge of the bed, the letter folded neatly on the nightstand, unable to let it out of reach. The words had carried light into her day, but now the silence returned with its sharp edges. The lamp's glow stretched across the floor in a narrow pool, and the hum of the refrigerator downstairs was replaced by the eerie quiet of midnight. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders, rocking slightly, whispering the words she had read hours earlier. "You are not finished." But her heart argued back, reminding her that grief doesn't leave when daylight fades. Sleep became a battle. Each time her eyes closed, her mind replayed the hospital corridor, the sterile smell of antiseptic, the echo of machines that marked time until they didn't anymore. She saw his hand lying still, veins no longer pulsing with life, and felt the panic of not knowing how to live after goodbye. The letter told her to laugh again, but laughter felt impossible, almost insulting. Her tears dampened the pillow, warm and relentless, soaking through until the fabric clung to her cheek. She wanted to believe the words, yet every tear seemed to erase their power, as if sorrow was stronger than ink. She reached for the Bible, her hands trembling as she opened to the Psalms he used to read aloud. Her eyes skimmed verses, but the words swam in and out of focus, her sobs breaking their rhythm. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." She whispered the line, but the shadows in her room felt too loud, too close. Fear curled inside her chest like smoke, whispering lies that her prayers were wasted. She slammed the book shut, startled by her own frustration, and buried her face in her hands. Was it wrong to be angry at God? Was faith supposed to be this fragile? At 3 in the morning, she sat upright in bed, heart racing as though she had run a mile. The silence of the house was pierced only by the ticking of the clock in the hallway, each second dragging her further into despair. She wanted to scream, but the sound lodged in her throat. The air tasted of metal, bitter and sharp, like sorrow had seeped into the very oxygen she breathed. She pressed her forehead against her knees, curling tight, whispering broken prayers into the blanket. "Why did you take him? Why didn't you answer me? Where are you now?" Each question hung unanswered in the darkness, making the night feel endless. The doubt grew louder as hours passed. What if the letter was not a message of hope, but only a cruel reminder of what she had lost? What if faith was only for people stronger than her, people who could stand after storms instead of collapsing beneath them? She felt like an intruder in her own skin, carrying a grief too large for her frame. Her reflection in the window startled her. Pale, hollow-eyed, lips trembling as if she didn't recognize the woman staring back. She touched the glass, the chill shocking her back into herself, and pulled away quickly as though afraid of the stranger she had become. Yet even in her torment, the words of the letter returned, uninvited but steady. "Open the door when someone knocks. God will send people." She scoffed through her tears. Who could possibly knock at such an hour? Who would even care enough to come? The cynicism burned, but beneath it flickered a fragile ember of longing. That maybe, just maybe, the letter was right. Maybe she wasn't as invisible as her sorrow insisted. That thought was enough to keep her awake until dawn began to bleed through the blinds, painting faint stripes of gold on the wall. She had survived another night, though barely. Her body sagged with exhaustion, her mind raw from the storm of doubt. The letter still sat on the nightstand, its folded edges catching the soft glow of morning. She reached for it, clutching it to her chest, not because it erased her pain, but because it tethered her to something outside of it. As the day stretched before her, she whispered, "If there's a reason I'm still here, show me." The silence lingered, patient and unresolved, like the pause before a knock on the door. The morning carried a fragile quiet, the kind that follows storms but never promises they're over. She shuffled through the house, her body heavy from another sleepless night. The letter still folded in her hand like a talisman she refused to release. Coffee brewed weak in the pot, its scent thin and bitter, filling the kitchen but offering no comfort. She sat at the table staring at the steam rising from her cup, as if answers might form in the swirling tendrils. The sunlight crept slowly across the floor, golden stripes crawling toward her feet, illuminating the Bible still resting open from the night before. She lowered her eyes, whispering under her breath, "If you're really here, give me something." The knock came soft at first, barely audible against the hum of the refrigerator. She frowned, unsure if she had imagined it. A second knock followed, firmer, insistent. Her chest tightened. She had avoided neighbors for months, pretending not to hear when the doorbell rang, unwilling to face their pity or questions she could not answer. But now, the letter's words echoed in her mind like a command. "Open the door when someone knocks. God will send people." She froze, staring at the door from across the room, her pulse racing. Could this be coincidence or something more? Her bare feet dragged across the floor, each step heavier than the last. She reached for the handle but hesitated, hand hovering above the cold metal as if crossing a threshold between despair and possibility. The wood smelled faintly of rain from last night's storm, damp and earthy. She pressed her ear against the door and heard a faint shuffle of shoes, the quiet exhale of someone waiting. Fear whispered that it would only be disappointment, another reminder of how far she had fallen from normal life. But the letter seemed to whisper back, urging her forward. With trembling fingers, she turned the knob. The hinges creaked softly, and light from the porch spilled into the dim hallway. There stood her neighbor, an older woman with silver hair pulled into a bun, holding a basket wrapped in a faded cloth. The woman's eyes softened at the sight of her, though worry etched faint lines around them. "I haven't seen you in so long," the neighbor said gently. "I thought you might need a meal." The words struck like a blow and a blessing at once. She wanted to retreat into the safety of solitude, but the warmth in the neighbor's gaze anchored her in place. The basket smelled of baked bread and herbs, the scent drifting through the doorway and filling the hollow spaces of her home. Her throat tightened as she accepted it with both hands, the weight surprisingly heavy, grounding her. She mumbled a thank you, her voice barely audible, but the neighbor only nodded, as if understanding that gratitude sometimes hides behind silence. The woman touched her arm softly and added, "You're not alone, dear. Don't forget that." The touch lingered like a benediction before the neighbor stepped back down the porch. She closed the door slowly, leaning her forehead against the wood as tears pressed against her eyes. The basket sat on the table, its cloth catching the morning light, a symbol too ordinary to be coincidence. She unfolded the letter once more, reading the line about opening the door. The ink seemed to glow now, alive with confirmation. Her sobs came not from despair, but from something deeper, an ache of being seen, of being remembered by both heaven and earth. She whispered into the quiet, "Was this you?" and felt her heart pulse with something she hadn't known in months: hope. Still, as the house settled into silence again, a question lingered sharp and unresolved. If God could send someone with bread and kindness, could he also restore what felt permanently broken inside her? She stared at the closed door, the echo of the knock still alive in her chest, and realized this was only the beginning. Outside, the street hummed with life, footsteps moving past her porch, voices drifting faintly. Somewhere in that ordinary rhythm was a divine thread weaving her back into the world. She just didn't know yet how tightly it would pull her. The basket on the table became more than food. It became a reminder that life, though fragile, still reached for her. For days, she returned to the letter again and again, pressing her fingers along the ink as if to draw strength from the strokes of his hand. The neighbor's kindness echoed in her memory, stitched together with the words, "God will send people." Something stirred inside her, small, hesitant, but undeniable. She began to rise earlier, opening the curtains to let the sunlight paint the walls gold, watering the neglected fern on the windowsill until green pushed back through wilted leaves. They were simple acts, but they whispered of renewal. Yet the stack of bills on the counter refused to disappear. Each envelope reminded her of the practical weight of survival, of the world that demanded she move forward. One evening, she sat at the table with the letter unfolded, whispering his line about spring after winter. She realized that survival meant more than waiting for miracles. It meant stepping into the world again, even when her legs trembled. The next morning, she dressed in the plain black trousers she had not worn since before the hospital, smoothing the fabric with shaky hands. In the mirror, her face looked worn but not lifeless. She whispered, "I will try." The first attempt came quietly. She found her old resume, crumpled in a folder, and typed new lines at her desk, her fingers stiff as if learning language again. The clack of the keyboard echoed through the empty house, a sound both foreign and empowering. She applied to jobs she once would have dismissed, positions humbler than the ones she had held, but they represented motion, and motion felt like grace. Each application sent carried a fragment of courage, a fragile seed planted in uncertain soil. She didn't expect a response, but for the first time in months, she was participating in tomorrow. Her faith wrestled with her fear. At night, doubts returned like unwelcome guests. "You won't be chosen. You're too broken. They'll see it in your eyes." She lay awake, clutching the letter, whispering back his promise. "You are not finished." Sometimes she repeated it until exhaustion carried her into restless dreams. In the morning, she forced herself to rise anyway, to brew coffee, to check emails with trembling hope. Nothing came at first, and discouragement coiled in her chest like a serpent. Yet she kept applying, one after another, not because she believed she would succeed, but because she was learning how to stand again. Then, one afternoon, her phone buzzed against the table. The screen lit with an unfamiliar number, her breath catching as if the world held still. She let it ring twice before answering, her voice uneven. On the other end, a calm voice invited her to an interview. It was a modest office job, nothing like the career she once dreamed of, but it was real, tangible, a doorway opening when she had nearly surrendered to closed walls. Her hand shook as she wrote down the details, the pen scratching across paper like thunder in her quiet house. She hung up and sat in silence, the letter pressed against her chest. That evening, she ironed a blouse she had almost donated, the faint smell of heat and fabric rising as steam hissed from the iron. She laid the clothes across her bed, a simple uniform of dignity, and prayed, awkwardly, haltingly, for strength. "If this is from you," she whispered, "let me walk through it." She fell asleep early, the letter still beside her pillow, as if her husband's words could guard her through the night. For the first time, her dreams did not replay the hospital. Instead, she dreamed of walking into a building filled with light, her shoulders no longer bent beneath grief. But when morning arrived, fear surged again, whispering of failure, of humiliation, of the weight of trying and falling short. She stood before the mirror, smoothing her blouse, her reflection pale but determined. She took the letter from the nightstand, folding it carefully into her bag, carrying it like a shield. As she stepped toward the door, the silence of the house seemed to lean in, holding its breath. She paused, hand on the knob, whispering, "I will not turn back." And though the hallway beyond was unknown, the words of the letter pulsed steady in her chest, urging her forward, toward a moment she could not yet imagine. The morning of her interview arrived with a sky veiled in gray clouds, the kind that promise rain, yet hold it back until the world is ready. She walked through the quiet streets, her shoes tapping against the damp pavement, carrying a folder with her resume and the letter tucked carefully inside her bag. Every step felt both fragile and defiant, as if she were pushing against an invisible tide. She followed the familiar path near the river, the place where she and her husband once walked on cool evenings, where laughter had mixed with the sound of water. Today the river roared louder, swollen from recent storms, its current reflecting the turmoil inside her chest. She stopped at the edge, gripping the wooden railing, her breath catching in uneven bursts. The interview was hours away, yet her nerves twisted violently, threatening to undo her. She pulled the letter from her bag, unfolded it with trembling hands, and read the words again, "You are not finished." Her husband's handwriting looked almost alive against the pale backdrop of the page, every stroke like a voice rising above the noise of doubt. She closed her eyes, pressing the paper against her heart, and whispered, "If this is your will, give me strength." The wind lifted her hair gently, as though nature itself paused to listen. Her knees gave way, and she sank to the damp grass, ignoring the way dew seeped into her trousers. She clasped her hands tightly, pressing them to her lips. Her prayer spilled out raw and unpolished, the kind that rose more from desperation than eloquence. "God, I can't do this alone. I've tried to hold on, but I am weak. If you're with me, show me you are here. Let me feel your presence. Let me know I am not invisible." Her voice cracked on the last word, carried away by the rush of water. A bird broke through the stillness, its call sharp and sudden, as if answering. She lifted her eyes to the sky, where a narrow break in the clouds allowed a shaft of sunlight to fall directly onto the river. The golden beam shimmered across the surface, scattering light into her tear-filled eyes. She inhaled sharply, the air cool and earthy, and for the first time in months, peace pressed against her chest like a gentle hand. It did not erase her grief, but it steadied her, wrapped her in something larger than sorrow. She whispered, "Thank you," and let the words drift upward with the breeze. For a fleeting moment, she knew she was not forgotten. Sitting there, her hands damp with grass, she realized the letter had carried her this far, but God's whisper was carrying her further. She folded the page carefully, kissed the edge as though sealing a vow, and placed it back in her bag. The sound of the river softened in her ears, transformed from chaos into rhythm. She stood, brushing mud from her knees, her spine straighter, her gaze clearer. The road ahead still frightened her, but she felt equipped, not with certainty, but with the assurance that she was not walking it alone. If you're finding strength in her journey, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. These stories of faith remind us that even when life feels broken beyond repair, God has ways of weaving light back into the shadows. Join us as we walk together through testimonies that restore hope. With renewed steps, she turned from the river, carrying the peace of that moment like armor. Yet even as calm wrapped around her, doubt lingered at the edges of her thoughts, whispering that one answered prayer might not be enough to sustain tomorrow. She gripped the strap of her bag tighter, the letter pressing firmly against her side, and kept walking toward the unknown. As the office building loomed in the distance, tall and imposing, she swallowed hard. Her journey of faith was far from over. In fact, it was only beginning, and the next door she faced would test her more deeply than she could imagine. The interview day unfolded like a fragile thread, stretched between fear and hope. She arrived early, smoothing the wrinkles in her blouse, clutching her bag with the letter hidden safely inside. The office building loomed tall, its glass facade reflecting a restless sky. Inside, the waiting area smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood, voices muffled behind closed doors. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she rehearsed silent prayers, her fingers brushing the folded paper as if drawing strength from the ink itself. Hours later, she walked out with her chest heavy, uncertain if she had said enough, done enough, been enough. The city noise pressed against her ears, indifferent to her silent plea for reassurance. Days passed with no word. She returned to the silence of her house, folding laundry, watering the fern, moving through motions that felt both grounding and empty. Each evening, she placed the letter on the table, reading the lines that had become her lifeline. "You are not finished. There will be light again." She wanted to believe them, but discouragement curled around her shoulders like a heavy cloak. Doubt whispered louder each night. "They forgot you. You don't matter." She fought back with whispered prayers, yet the silence on the other end of her phone grew unbearable. Then, on a gray afternoon when the clouds pressed low, her phone lit up with an unfamiliar number. Her breath caught, the room spinning in slow motion. She hesitated, staring at the screen as if it carried both life and death in its glow. Finally, she swiped to answer, her voice shaky. The calm tone of a stranger greeted her. "We'd like to offer you the position. Can you start Monday?" The words landed like rain on parched soil, soaking into the dry cracks of her spirit. She sank into the chair, pressing the phone against her ear, unable to breathe for a moment. Tears blurred her vision as she murmured a trembling yes. The representative explained details, salary, hours, expectations, but the words barely registered. All she could hear was the sound of a door opening where she had feared only walls. Her hand clutched the letter, pressed hard against her chest, as if to confirm what she now believed. The promise wasn't empty. The ink that once felt like memory now pulsed with life, reminding her that God's timing was stitched through even the smallest details. She ended the call and collapsed into sobs, this time not from despair, but from the shock of hope realized. The house, once so suffocating, seemed to expand with the sound of her crying, as though its walls absorbed her joy. She slid to the floor, the phone still in her hand, the letter spread open beside her. Through her tears, she whispered, Thank you for not forgetting me." The silence answered not with emptiness, but with warmth, as if the very air wrapped its arms around her. For the first time in months, she laughed through her tears, the sound awkward and broken but alive. That night she lay in bed unable to sleep, her mind replaying the call like a hymn on repeat. Every detail of the day felt different. Her breath lighter, her heart less burdened, her house less empty. She placed the letter on her pillow, fingers brushing the ink until her eyelids closed. In her dreams, she walked down a long hallway, every door she passed unlocking one by one, light spilling through each frame until she could no longer see the shadows. She woke before dawn, her cheeks damp but her heart steady. Yet beneath the joy, a new question stirred, a question that would not leave her alone. If God could open doors for her, what else was he asking her to step into? What would faith demand of her next? As the first rays of sunlight stretched across the ceiling, she realized the call was more than a job. It was an invitation into a new life, one she wasn't sure she was ready to embrace. She sat up, clutching the letter against her chest, her pulse quickening at the thought. The future had opened its arms, but would she have the courage to walk fully into it? Monday morning arrived with the crisp chill of dawn clinging to the air. She stood before the mirror, adjusting the collar of her blouse, her hands trembling but her shoulders squared. The letter rested safely inside her bag, folded neatly like a secret vow. For the first time in months, she applied lipstick, a soft shade she used to wear when life felt lighter. The reflection staring back was not the woman she had been weeks ago. Lines of grief still marked her face, but beneath them flickered something steadier, something resilient. She whispered, "One step at a time," and stepped into the cool morning. The office building loomed again, tall and gleaming, yet it no longer felt like an enemy. She walked through its glass doors, the hum of conversation and clicking keyboards wrapping around her like a new rhythm. The scent of coffee and printer ink filled the air, grounding her in the ordinary. A manager greeted her kindly, handing her a badge with her name printed boldly across the plastic. For a moment, she stared at the letters, almost disbelieving they belonged to her. That simple badge felt like a resurrection, a reminder she still had a place in this world. Her first day unfolded in hesitant steps. Tasks were explained, responsibilities outlined, co-workers introduced with polite smiles. She stumbled at times, her nerves threatening to unravel her, but each small success built a fragile confidence. At lunch, she sat quietly at the corner of the cafeteria, unwrapping a sandwich she had prepared at home. Alone, yet not lonely, she touched the letter in her bag, hearing his words echo, "You are not finished." The truth of that line settled into her bones, stronger now than ever. For the first time in months, food tasted like nourishment instead of survival. Evenings at home began to shift. The silence of the house no longer pressed as hard against her chest. She opened windows, letting in the cool air scented with rain-soaked leaves. She rearranged the furniture, scrubbed the floors, and placed fresh flowers in a vase by the window. The fern, once yellowing, now pushed out bright green leaves under her attentive care. Each small act became worship, a declaration that life was worth tending again. The house, once a tomb, was slowly becoming a home again. She found herself watching for opportunities to give back. At the office, she noticed a younger coworker struggling with a task and quietly offered guidance, her voice gentle but steady. The gratitude in the girl's eyes touched her deeply. At the grocery store, she paid for a stranger's items when their card failed, remembering how kindness had once arrived at her door in the form of bread. Her life was no longer defined only by receiving, but by giving. And in giving, she felt her own healing quicken, as though generosity stitched together what grief had torn apart. One evening, she sat by the river again, the letter unfolded on her lap, her eyes tracing the familiar words. The current shimmered with sunset light, painting the water in hues of gold and crimson. She prayed, not with desperation this time, but with gratitude. "Thank you for bringing me this far," she whispered, her voice steady. She thought of the neighbor's knock, the unexpected call, the first day back at work. Each step had been a thread in a larger tapestry she could not yet see fully. Her tears fell, but they were softer now, carrying both sorrow and hope in equal measure. Yet even as she felt the strength of renewal, she knew her journey was not finished. Healing is not a straight path, and faith is not without its trials. The letter had carried her through nights of despair and into mornings of promise, but she sensed God was calling her deeper, beyond survival, into purpose. She folded the letter carefully, pressing it against her heart. As the river whispered beside her, she lifted her eyes to the horizon. Something stirred inside her, a sense that another chapter was waiting, one that would test not only her faith, but her courage to live it out loud. The weeks blended into months, and the rhythm of her new life began to settle like a steady heartbeat. Mornings no longer felt unbearable. Instead, they carried a quiet sense of expectancy. She rose before sunrise, brewing coffee while the golden light spilled through her curtains, painting soft patterns across the kitchen table. The letter remained in its place beside her bed each night, and in her bag each day, never far from her reach. It had become more than paper. It was a bridge between what she had lost and what she had learned to live for. She framed the letter in glass, hanging it on the wall above her nightstand, where the words would greet her every evening. Sometimes she would pause before sleep to trace the ink through the glass, whispering the lines like prayers. "Promise me you won't give up. You are not finished." The faint reflection of her face in the frame reminded her she had kept that promise. Not perfectly, not without tears, but faithfully enough to still be standing. Each night, she slept with a peace she once believed was forever beyond her reach. Her home transformed quietly into a sanctuary. The fern by the window had grown lush and full, spilling green against the glass, a small resurrection of life she had once neglected. Fresh bread sat cooling on the counter, her attempt at recreating the neighbor's kindness, ready to share with someone else. She no longer shut the world out. Friends visited again, filling the rooms with laughter and conversation, their voices echoing off the walls that had once only known silence. What was once a tomb of grief now resonated with the hum of renewal. At work, her colleagues began to seek her out, not only for help with tasks, but for comfort during their own struggles. She carried herself differently, with a calm that came not from forgetting her pain, but from surviving it. Her story, when shared in fragments, became a lantern for others still wandering through shadows. She realized then that her husband's words had been more than farewell. They had been a prophecy, pointing her toward a purpose she had not yet imagined. Her survival was never meant for her alone. It was meant to spill over into the lives around her. One Sunday morning, she returned to church for the first time since the funeral. The wooden pews smelled of polished oak, the air warm with the faint sweetness of candle wax. When the congregation rose to sing, her voice trembled, but it joined theirs, a fragile thread woven into a greater tapestry of sound. She opened her Bible again, laying the framed letter beside it, and tears fell onto the page. They were not tears of loss, but of restoration. In that moment, she knew her story had come full circle. God had never abandoned her. He had been waiting all along. As the service ended, she lingered in the quiet, whispering gratitude. She thought of the nights of doubt, the knock at the door, the phone call, the riverbank prayer, all steps that had led her here. She pressed her hand against the letter, now sealed forever in its frame, and whispered, "I kept the promise. I didn't give up." The weight of grief still lived inside her, but it no longer chained her. It had become a teacher, a companion that shaped her into someone stronger, gentler, more open to grace. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. John 1:5. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share in the comments where you're watching from. Every testimony reminds us that even in our darkest hours, God is still writing hope into our lives. And just like her, may we hold on to the letters of love He places in our paths, the reminders that we are not finished and that light will always break through.